This week, Google employees walk out worldwide.
Then the battle between Bumble, Tinder, and Match starts to get ugly.
And Apple News doubles down on politics and humans.
And that's Future Forward for this midterm election week. I'm Gene DeRose.
And I'm Steve Rosenbaum. And we will launch. And launch we shall. So
you must be exhausted.
I'm pacing myself.
Yeah.
So I want to dive right into this Google thing because it's so interesting. First of all, to have that many employees walk out, I was trying to get an actual number. So it was all over the world. It was worldwide. I'll pull up the image with the reporting next to it.
Sure.
I didn't see the walkout in New York, but it must have been massive.
Yeah.
So they're reporting thousands, and if you read the TechCrunch article, the thing that was unusual about it was even the organizers didn't want to give their names.
Right. Well, it's an interesting mix because here you have the company that's kind of pushed hard into China and done some things that have upset some people and has its own issues, but I think what you find is that because it's a technology company and it's an advanced technology company, their ability to activate and mobilize really fast, no matter what it's going to be, is significant. So I'd kind of factor that into the significance of this. But look, you and I, we've talked about this for a few months now. This is a thing that's starting to happen at companies, especially ones that think they are enlightened.
So I think what pushed the Google employees over the edge was the Android founder who had been accused of sexual harassment being fired with a $90 million payout. Right. And that seemed to be the thing that pushed people over the edge.
Yeah, I mean, because look, this is what's going on is it's a combination of two or three things, and in that case, the one, which is this kind of Me Too movement, is it being managed within my company, is a big deal, as it should be. But then there's also, what are the behaviors of our company at large? Are they doing business with the wrong people, in this political environment? And then, look, we're in an era for people a little older like us who can barely remember when, unions were a big deal in corporate America. And this is kind of the next generation, right? When companies themselves mobilize instead of the guild for a particular category.
So the organizers said that Google was running a culture of complicity. Now, it's funny, having run companies, I can make arguments on both sides. So I always forget his last name, Andy, who's the Android guy who they.
Oh yeah, I'm not going to remember, but I know who you mean.
Presumably, to be fair, I never fully understand when people negotiate exits, right? I didn't understand that story at CBS either. If we're firing you, why don't we say, don't let the door hit you on the way out, and you can come sue us for whatever you think you're owed. But, obviously there's relationships and there's deals and there's, it's a complicated. I have no idea what the Android story is, by the way.
Well, look, I think the thing is the black and white part is a person needs to be fired and gotten rid of, and we need to excavate and deal with this. And that's not a variable in these situations, and it shouldn't be. The part that's a gray area is, look, every person has a different deal, a different exit, a different severance package, and there's only so much you can do to get around the legalities of some of these situations. And so I think that sometimes our desire to see a simplistic answer is a little messy when it comes to the fact that someone is entitled to some giant earnout. It's insane. The Les Moonves thing is crazy, right? He should only get $30 million, not $80 million.
So the Vanity Fair article has the numbers. 17,000 Google employees walked out.
That's a significant number.
That's a bit, So I was thinking about what does that impact, right? Does that mean ads don't get approved? Does that mean software doesn't get written? What would be the end user? Does that mean Gmail falls over? What would be the end user impact on almost 20,000 employees taking a day off at the same time?
Yeah, I would guess the analog is like when the government shuts down. There are things that they don't really want things to go cold, right? This is not France when the country shuts down, literally when there are strikes. Somehow I don't have any memory that my Gmail stopped working or, my Chrome started to glitch or anything like that. And, maybe there were a few things that went wrong, but I think this is kind of like, if this is the era of conscious uncoupling, I have a feeling these are kinds of, safe walkouts.
Well, and in fact, the CEO of Alphabet, I keep wanting to call it Google, but I'll call it Alphabet, did in fact send out an email the day before the walkout saying, we're aware this is happening, we support it, essentially, I understand part of it is, Google is at this really tricky place, right? I mean, are they this scrappy little technology will make us all freer, up from the ground startup, or are they one of the world's biggest companies controlling information and doing business with governments? And, and the answer is, they're not so old that they've forgotten where they came from, the garage they were born in, but they're pretty much out of the garage stage at this point.
Right. And, and unlike Facebook, which still has Zuckerberg, its founder, in the catbird seat, both in controlling stock and running the day-to-day operations of the company, you have in the founders of Google guys who are no longer the CEOs, who are, it's a little, we're really in a transition period with this second wave of billion-dollar tech companies. Where as they hit their kind of adolescent years, where the identity of the founders and the complicity is always the news story,
right?
But is it the news, right? And is it legitimate? Is it appropriate? And do the guys have distance from this, or should we be hearing from them a little bit more? Because we don't.
So here was the demands of the organizers of this event. They said we want a confidential reporting procedure for sexual harassment. That seems like a checkbox. I don't know why they wouldn't have that already. I think most companies have some version of that.
Yes.
They wanted to not be tied to binding arbitration. That's going to be harder to win because big companies install arbitration because they really don't want to go to court.
And I believe they almost have a fiduciary kind of lockdown that makes it hard for them to have such a free and independent hand in things. You kind of have to default to things that are not going to be at either impasse or really, really scary, uncontrollable fights.
Yeah. Now, I read a little bit. I'd not heard about the Android guy, and the charges that are kind of leveled against him are muddy, and at least in the stuff that I read. He dated a bunch of people that were coworkers, and then there was some allegations that he behaved inappropriately. But it seemed like it was blurry where the line was between, like. By the way, and I don't know for a fact that was that the reason he was let go because of the maybe it was. The truth is I didn't follow it. I mean,
well, I think in the end, it was a tipping point, and that's me reading between the lines, because I think a lot of these situations end up being like that. Somebody's well past their earnout. They're, it's not so much a scapegoat, but he just as soon go grab that severance package, even if it's half what it's supposed to be, etc. Look, the bottom line is that we're still almost at the end of the beginning of the fallout and the new normal for the Me Too movement, which means there are endless situations across corporate America and global, HR that has to air these things out. And are they going to be done privately, publicly? Are they being managed by the company? We all know, because we've been in the world long enough, that it has been until very recently an endemic problem. And you've got people that if they're 40, 50, 60 something and still at these companies, bad stuff has happened. And it's a history of this. And 15 years ago, people unfortunately didn't look twice at the kind of sexual harassment environment and ecosystem that led to a lot of dating of junior females by senior males.
All right. So which actually brilliantly brings us right into the Tinder Bumble.
Accident.
No. It was a brilliant producer move. So there's a lawsuit between the founder of Bumble and Tinder and its corporate overlord Match.com, which is IAC, which is Diller. And it turns out it's complicated, right? Because it goes back to little known fact that the founder of Bumble was a co-founder of Tinder.
Oh yes, yeah.
And it seems like, at least from her claims, was treated pretty badly.
Yep.
And so Tinder then is acquired by IAC, and as the story in the Times is, and there's a couple of different pieces which we'll put in the links. I guess Match tried to buy Bumble a couple of times.
Right.
Made some offers, got access to some confidential information, and then basically walked away from the offer, and in fact took some of Tinder's or Bumble's UI and built it into Tinder.
And built into Match.
Into Match, right?
Right, because at the same time, the overlapping thing that was happening is this issue that perhaps the woman who founded Bumble had taken a lot of the IP or some of this goes back to the whole notion of method patents, and is merely the swipe left, swipe right something that you have free reign over if you put a patent down in the category of dating apps, right?
Well, I mean, if you own, if in fact Match owns swipe, or Tinder owns swipe left, swipe right, theoretically, I mean, a lot of people owe them money, not just Bumble.
That's right, but that is part of what's on trial in the next few years, which is our kind of round 2 or round 3 in a big way of these sort of so-called method patents, which are less about a very, very unique engineering thing, but a kind of a conceptual idea that's applied to a vertical category. Swipe right, swipe left still may be owned by somebody else in HR apps, but in dating it's owned by someone. Is there even such a thing that's valid? And,
all right, so I want to ask, I want to bring the court together and ask Judge DeRose. So you're now there. Bumble has dropped its $400 million lawsuit against Match, which I guess I didn't exactly understand. That just happened. Again, theoretically, part of it is these things are expensive, and somebody and Diller clearly, got involved in it. This is not
right. And the fact that it is Diller and a company like Match, which actually in the world of social media, your average millennial consumers may think Tinder and Bumble are like bigger, but Match is part of a very large corporation that knows how to lawyer up and use brute force to win regardless of the merits of the situation, right? You got to go for a 5-year lawsuit here, and at the end you might have to pay back some of these legal fees, but do you have the guts to stay the course, or even the resources?
So I guess my question is, do you think Bumble dropped its lawsuit against Match because it thought it didn't have claims, or because the countersuit was just so overwhelming that they said, you know what, we don't have the capital to run our and the bandwidth to run our business and be in this 5-year lawsuit?
Well, I'll do the the weak answer, which is that at the very least I know this must have been heavily influenced by, regardless of merit, the burden of maintaining this lawsuit, that they were like, it could kill us to win this, so Is it worth it, right? So I think, and this is unfortunately where we're at with this kind of thing, which is ironic, since we're in an age not just of fading kind of hard-assness of patents within the U.S., but an international and global environment where a place like China doesn't respect or have appreciation for them at all. And they're, unprosecutable issues that lead us to these, very thinly skinned versions of some of these services all over the world.
I mean, let's go up to the 30,000 foot level for a minute.
Yes. And talk about the dating app space too, because that's part of what we care about.
Well, see, I was going to talk about something
not at an individual level.
I mean, I think whenever big, what's interesting about this is Bumble clearly was for sale.
Right.
They had a bunch of offers. When you're doing, when you're sharing data, you can sign NDAs until you're blue in the face, but the reality is you're essentially showing your competition everything they want to know about you.
That's right.
Where you're succeeding, where you're failing, what your metrics are, what's flattening out. And the critical thing was that Bumble had this, what they felt was proprietary to UI that said women go first. Like men can't approach women, women get to approach men.
I'm glad you said that, because that's a big distinction for them. Yeah.
Right. And I guess then it was either Tinder or Match, I don't remember which, basically added that to their service.
Match, I believe, or as an option.
Right.
And yeah, and I think you kind of said it, but let's just be clear. You know, Match went through the process of trying to acquire Bumble. It's easy to see, oh, you're not going to go with our deal? Well, then we're going to make you unbuyable, because other than us, there's not too many other people out there.
Right.
So we can crush you by one way or the other here. You know, and this is part of what goes on in this surprise. If you go back 20 years, this is a surprisingly lucrative and evergreen market. You know, this world of these dating apps and the kind of slightly larger concentric circle around them. This is a big deal. And you know, there are 20 or 30 other players that are 3 levels down, but other than these 3 and maybe 1 or 2 others, there's no one else that would acquire them except someone that might step into the space.
And by the way, this is not an unusual behavior. I mean, if you remember the Amazon Diapers.com acquisition, they were negotiating to buy Diapers.com as they were building an Amazon branded diapers landing page, and they essentially said to the diapers guys, here's the deal. Yeah, we're going to either buy you or compete with you, and we're going to do both in parallel. So either, you know, we've made you an offer and that's our number and we're not moving. And by the way, every day that goes by, we get more traffic and you get less. So, you know, what do we actually, I mean, you know, in some ways you could argue that that's not any different. I don't know the internal machinations, but that's probably not dramatically different than the Bumble Match negotiation.
And the other thing that I think is important to add, and I think this is a fascinating thing strategically, is that, you know, from a marketplace point of view and a fundamentals of the marketplace, you know, in social media, this is a space where the invisible participation of especially Facebook, a little bit Instagram, but Snapchat, like, you know, these are the places where these people live socially. And, you know, at the very least, Facebook has dabbled and threatened to step into this space, but really kind of hasn't. And so you kind of have this, it's really I mean, I tend to be less interested in the corporate entrances and exits and more of like, you know, where is the power in this stuff and what is going on in the typical, you know, set of users. It's really interesting. But and there's a lot more to say about this, but this is a battle royale between 3 players. Something's going to break in the next 18 months that kind of is going to leave the dust settled in a very interesting kind of next step way.
All right, so let's move to Apple. So Apple has been pretty invisible, but pretty increasingly important in the news space. There was an article in the New York Times in which they essentially told the story of Apple News. It was surprising in a number of ways. Apple is notoriously close-lipped about everything it does. Yeah. And so this was unlikely and transparent. And buried in the article, if you read below the fold, the Times essentially admitted as much and said that the access that they needed required rather complex and ongoing negotiations with Apple about essentially about what they were going to see, what they weren't going to see. You know, I assume that Apple didn't get to control the article, but it seems like they did try to. Which is,
I mean, look, just as an aside, because there's more to say about this that's substantive, it's almost as if Apple wants a piece of the controversy, which is pretty darn ugly and not necessarily positive, that Facebook and Twitter and Google are in the sort of world of fake news and persuasion and social media around this stuff, when they're kind of in the background of it. I think the reality is there's a lot of business in this, and that's what they care about. The part that you and I have talked about already that is part of the story here too is this idea of, how much do they care about being in the middle of news in the first place? One, two, what value do they put on curation and human involvement versus three, the direction that kind of this AI-driven personalization, to index your news choices. Because if we experience, our iOS experience right now at the front end is all this kind of Apple stuff that gets in my face right now about news that I kind of keep pushing to the side because I want to go to the New York Times site.
So let's make a list of all the things Apple has not done.
Right.
They have no social network.
And they've always been bad at it. They've always been bad at it.
Right. They have no video products. They have no YouTube competitor.
Right.
Facebook has video, Google has video, YouTube has video, Vimeo has video, Apple has none.
That's right. That's right.
They have a marginally functional cloud thing, which still makes me think of Mobile Me, which makes me shiver. But now, iCloud, I guess, is working, although it seems like mostly it impales you on it in ways that are not helpful.
Yeah, and it's sort of a consumery version of an enterprise you must have rather than something I even understand what the brand is, right? Because it's changed from iCloud to My Files now in the world of iOS. Right. And then don't forget music, right? Because in a way, for someone who pioneered the backbone and the process of how music happens, they have, again, I would argue that over and over again they've failed to compete with Pandora or Spotify, even though the brute force that they can bring to it means they could claim that Apple Music is something subsequent even to acquiring Beats and all the stuff that happened around that. But they have not particularly done a good job with that.
So Lauren Kern, who's the editor-in-chief of Apple News, surprisingly transparent. I mean, I did some research in Apple News a year ago, and she was, for all intents and purposes, invisible on the internet.
That's right.
Mean, and so for her to allow, like, when you read the article and they talk about, we're looking at this story, we're reading it to see which one has better coverage, we're choosing whether or not to do Washington Post or I'm like, really? This is her on a daily basis. I assumed there were people one level below her or even two levels below her that were deciding mostly what goes on the news feed, and the answer is there isn't.
That's why I think it's ironic that it's only been because nobody has basically cared, and the impact has been so small that there hasn't been a kerfuffle around the danger of that kind of subjectivity being brought to this, right? Because in the world of Google and Twitter and Facebook, if you bring any subjectivity to it, oh my God, you're going to make the liberal choices over and over again, and there needs to be investigations.
Now, meanwhile, also buried in this article, but worth mentioning, was the Times writer saying her deputy, who had worked at the New York Times and who requested to remain nameless for reasons of privacy. And I read that 3 times. Like, wait a minute, you're going to be the number 2 in charge of Apple News, which is going to use humans to curate, but you won't let the Times write your name down. Like, really? That seems not like. It seems like either you own the editorial. That would be like going to the New York Times and seeing a masthead page in which all of the names of the editors are redacted for privacy.
I completely agree, and it feels a little just awkward and ham-handed. The subtlety and the feeling for what media really is that is being brought to this, and I would just suggest, and I'll try not to dive too deep into this as a whole here, that you back up from 50,000 to like 100 or 200,000 feet and look at the history not just of Apple, but like of the Steve Jobs, point of view, right? This is a company. Are they progressive? Are they innovative? Are they a little old-fashioned? This is a hardware versus software mentality, a world that has depended upon firm control of the situation, a distrust of what happens when you let the inmates run things. People don't realize, Steve Jobs' brilliance was in innovating and bringing simplicity and elegance to the consumer front end and control. He didn't invent this world and never intended there to be thousands and thousands of apps. He didn't intend the world to be driven by social. His original set of deals with media companies were barely the successor to will include the CD-ROM version of your newspaper every day in the package you get. He's very old. They have been very old world and controlling. And I think the one thing I would say from an innovation point of view is that, their now longtime CEO is not an innovator there. He's just going to bring the sort of continue the same, way to this. And so I think that they don't, so they're not, the minute they succeed too much, they're going to get into some controversies that they're going to regret.
All right. So let's end on this note, though, because they also announced, as they kind of came out of the closet, that they were launching an Apple News real-time election hub on November 6th. And you know what? I got to tell you, my fingers are crossed that it's awesome.
Look, you and I talked about this a month ago when we talked about the humanity and curatorial and editorial day-to-day that's being brought to the store itself, right? The iTunes store and the App Store and things like that. And this is all part of, I think, the same thing. I think they are feeling slip through their hands a kind of feel for the consumer and the user. Look, this may be connected to why they decided to go to Brooklyn for their product launch last week instead of. I believe these are all part of the whole same set of stories, and we're going to have to just keep looking at it.
So what we're talking about is humanizing Apple.
Humanizing Apple. Yep.
All right. Well, that's going to be the headline of our podcast. We are out of time. Humanizing Apple, it shall be. And I think we'll watch. At least I will watch the Apple News midterm election app to see how it does. And
you are.
Yeah, and we'll be back next week with some, by then belated election results and moving on to back to technology.
Yeah, and what the future of it all means, because the important thing is that this is a big, giant litmus test for the 2020 elections, and it's been quite a insane little period, and we'll take stock of it the next few weeks.
See you next week.
Bye, Steve.